In the muted quiet of a cramped apartment in Brooklyn, Howard Schultz sat awake while the city outside finally surrendered to sleep. The walls around him were thin, almost porous, letting in the echoes of neighbors fighting, babies crying, pipes groaning under the pressure of another cold night. He stared at a notebook balanced on his knees, filled with uneven scrawls and numbers that never seemed to align, and wondered if he was building a vision or digging a grave for himself. His chest tightened with the thought that maybe all of it, every late night, every borrowed dollar, every restless dream, was nothing more than an elaborate way of setting himself up for humiliation. But he could not stop. He could not let go of the idea that there had to be more than the place he came from. Howard's earliest memories were not of triumph, but of absence, of his father limping back home after losing another job, of his mother crying quietly at the kitchen table, of the gnawing feeling of always being behind. Poverty wasn't simply the lack of money. It was a constant reminder that the world could crush you without even noticing you were there. His father had worked a series of low-paying jobs, never respected, never secure. When Howard was 7, his father broke his ankle on the job. No health insurance, no savings, no sympathy from his employer. Just silence, bills piling up, and the weight of failure pressing down on the family. Howard would never forget the shame in his father's eyes. That shame would brand him, become the fire in his lungs, the thing he tried to outrun. School was no sanctuary. Howard was an outsider, tall and awkward, the poor kid among classmates who had better clothes, better lunches, better futures waiting quietly for them. He discovered sports as a way to carve out space for himself. Football gave him a temporary shield, a way to channel anger into movement, bruises into pride. It got him a scholarship, a ticket out of the suffocating apartment in Brooklyn. But even then, he carried the secret, the gnawing truth that he didn't belong, that he was borrowing time and opportunity, and that at any moment, the world might take it all back. When he first set foot on a college campus, he felt like an intruder wandering through a foreign country. Students talked about vacations abroad, family businesses, connections that could open doors before they even knew what doors they wanted to walk through. Howard had none of that. He had grit, hunger, and an ache so deep it almost hurt to breathe. He studied communications, not because it was strategic, but because it was a language he could bend to his will. He worked odd jobs to cover rent and food, selling his time piece by piece. Every dollar was a reminder that he was playing a dangerous game, balancing survival with ambition. After graduation, he stumbled into sales job selling for Xerox, hustling appliances, learning how to talk to people until they forgot they didn't want what he was selling. He discovered he had a gift for persuasion, not smooth and effortless, but born from necessity. When you've grown up begging the world to notice you, you learn how to make people listen. Yet even as he started climbing in those early jobs, a voice inside him whispered, "This is not it. This is not what I came here for." The turning point came quietly, like so many things that shape a life. A small company in Seattle caught his attention, Starbucks. At the time, it wasn't the global giant it would one day become. It was a handful of stores selling coffee beans, equipment, and accessories. Nothing glamorous, nothing world-shaking. But something about the company's ethos, its roots in quality and authenticity, intrigued him. He reached out, persistent, almost desperate to be a part of it. The first answer was rejection. They didn't need him. They weren't hiring a salesman. Most people would have walked away. Howard couldn't. Something in him felt tethered to the idea, as if this obscure coffee company had the faint outline of his destiny sketched into it. He kept pushing, calling, writing, traveling across the country to knock on their door in person. Eventually, persistence cracked resistance. He was hired as director of marketing and retail operations, a modest title. But for Howard, it was the fragile beginning of everything. When he arrived in Seattle, The city felt like another planet compared to Brooklyn. Mist rolled off the water, the air carried a damp cold, and the streets moved slower than New York's restless chaos. Starbucks was small, its vision contained. They sold beans, not cups of coffee. They had loyal customers, but they weren't building a movement. Howard immersed himself, listening, learning, watching the way customers touched the beans as if they were artifacts from another world. But still, he knew something was missing. The revelation came during a business trip to Milan. Howard walked through the city and found himself pulled into an espresso bar. It wasn't just the coffee. It was the ritual, the theater of it. People leaned against counters, sipping shots of espresso, speaking with baristas who knew their names, their moods, their daily rhythms. Coffee wasn't a product there. It was an experience, a ritual, a pause in the day that carried meaning. He walked out of that cafe with a fire inside him. This was it. This was the bridge between who he was and who he could become. Back in Seattle, he tried to share his vision. He spoke about creating cafes where people could gather, not just buy beans. A third place between work and home, a community built around coffee. But the founders didn't see it. They were purists focused on selling beans and equipment. They thought his idea diluted the brand, made it too commercial. They dismissed him. The sting of rejection hit like a fist to the chest. For a moment, it felt like he was back in Brooklyn, the poor kid with dreams too big for the small world he was born into. But Howard had tasted the vision. He could not unsee it. The rejection left him with a choice: silence himself, remain an obedient employee, or take the terrifying step into the unknown. He chose the latter. He left Starbucks. With borrowed money and borrowed faith, he opened his own cafe, Il Giornale, designed in the image of those Italian espresso bars. The risk was staggering. He had no wealth, no safety net, just the thin rope of belief stretched across a canyon of doubt. Nights were sleepless. Days were endless. He knocked on doors of investors, most of whom laughed or turned him away. Coffee? As a gathering place? Who would pay for that in America? The word no followed him like a shadow, but he persisted. He opened Il Giornale, and people came. Slowly at first, then steadily. They lingered, they talked, they made it their place. Howard poured his soul into every detail, from the smell of the coffee to the way the space welcomed people who had nowhere else to go. It was fragile, precarious, always one bad week away from collapse, but it was alive. And in that fragile beginning, he saw proof that his vision was not madness. The true test came in 1987, when the original Starbucks owners decided to sell the company. Howard saw his chance, but it was also his nightmare. Buying Starbucks meant raising millions of dollars money he didn't have, money that seemed impossible for a man like him to gather. Once again, investors doubted him, questioned him, dismissed him. They saw a dreamer too obsessed with an idea that didn't fit America's habits. Each rejection carried the familiar sting of poverty, of standing outside looking in, of being told he wasn't enough. Still, he pressed forward. He told his story, again and again, until one investor finally saw not just a man selling coffee, but a man selling conviction. Slowly, the pieces came together. He raised the money, just enough to take the leap. When the deal closed, Howard Schultz, the boy from Brooklyn, who once watched his father crumble under the weight of invisibility, became the owner of Starbucks. But ownership was not triumph. It was the beginning of another storm. He now carried the weight of not only his own dream, but of every employee, every store, every customer who might come to believe in the vision. The pressure was suffocating. Failure was not just personal now. It was collective, public, devastating. At night, he still sat awake, staring at notebooks filled with numbers, wondering if he had made the greatest mistake of his life. And yet, beneath the doubt, there was something else. A fragile flicker of possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, he had taken the first true step out of the shadows of Brooklyn, out of the silence of rejection, into something that could carry meaning. Not certainty, not security, just possibility. The first victory came quietly, as they often do. A store filled with customers on a rainy afternoon. The hum of conversation, the clink of cups, the smell of roasted beans filling the air. Howard stood in the corner and watched. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe he wasn't building a ruin after all. Maybe he was building a place where people could belong. Howard never forgot that first store humming with life. The sound of conversation, mixed with the hiss of the espresso machine, was like a fragile heartbeat, proof that the dream could breathe. But he also knew how easily a heartbeat could falter. He had lived through collapse, through the sight of his father's spirit, crushed by a world that offered no second chances. And so, even in victory, Howard carried dread like an invisible weight. Success was never permanent. It was temporary oxygen in a room that could seal itself shut at any moment. The expansion of Starbucks was not glamorous in its early days. It was exhausting, a daily war against doubt, against financial ruin, against the quiet voices of investors who still whispered that the company was stretched too thin. Howard traveled constantly, visiting each store, training baristas, ensuring the atmosphere reflected not just coffee, but connection. He obsessed over details, lighting, furniture, the smell of beans when the door opened. Every corner mattered, because he knew he wasn't just selling a drink. He was selling a pause in time, a place where strangers could feel human again. But for every store that thrived, there was another that struggled, another that bled money. The line between triumph and failure was razor thin, and Howard felt it cut into him every night. A loneliness of leadership was another shadow. To the world, he appeared confident, a visionary steering his company forward. But behind closed doors, he was a man pacing hallways at 3 a.m., staring at bank statements, replaying conversations, doubting himself. He thought often of his father, the man who had been broken, not by a single failure, but by the cruelty of being invisible, disposable. Howard had sworn he would never let people who worked for him feel that way. And yet, as Starbucks grew, he felt the pull of two opposing forces, the need to protect his employees and the relentless demand of profit. Every decision carried the possibility of betrayal. There were days when the company came terrifyingly close to collapse. Days when payroll seemed impossible, when creditors circled, when the vision felt more like a delusion. Howard would sit with his head in his hands, feeling the weight of not just his dream, but of every barista who trusted him. The silence of those nights was suffocating. He could hear the echo of his childhood in it, the silence of a father without work, a mother without answers, a boy without hope. That memory haunted him, drove him, but also threatened to consume him. Still, Howard pressed forward, carried by something that felt less like confidence and more like defiance. He had been told no too many times, had been underestimated too often to believe the doubters now. When critics laughed at the idea that Americans would pay several dollars for a cup of coffee, he let their laughter sharpen him. He believed that what he was building wasn't just a business. It was a culture, a ritual, a need people didn't yet know they had. The first true taste of broader victory came in the early 1990s, when Starbucks began to expand beyond Seattle. Stores opened in Chicago and Vancouver. The reception was cautious, uncertain. Some failed, others thrived. But each one added to the fragile architecture of belief. Slowly, the name Starbucks began to mean something more than coffee. It began to carry the whisper of community, of aspiration, of a moment stolen from the chaos of life. And yet, with growth came critics, and with critics came doubt. Some said the company was moving too fast, that Howard was blinded by ambition. that Starbucks would collapse under the weight of its own expansion. The fear was real. He felt it at every investor meeting, every board discussion. The line between vision and arrogance was thin, and he often wondered on which side of that line he stood. Through it all, Howard carried scars from his past. He remembered being the boy who could not afford what others had, the young man who always felt like an outsider. Even as Starbucks grew, even as people began to recognize his name, he never fully shed that shadow. Success did not erase poverty. It only made its memory sharper. Every time he stood in a polished boardroom, he could still feel the worn floorboards of his childhood apartment beneath his feet. Every time he shook hands with investors, he remembered the calluses of his father's hands, empty of opportunity. The contrast was unbearable at times, as if he lived in two worlds simultaneously, one of abundance, one of deprivation. The early public offering of Starbucks was both exhilarating and terrifying. On paper, it was a triumph. The company had become something undeniable, a rising force. But Howard knew what lay beneath the surface, the constant battle to preserve the soul of the company while feeding the machine of growth. Wall Street demanded numbers, expansion, scale. Howard demanded humanity, values, connection. The two forces were not always aligned, and he often felt torn between them. To serve one was to risk betraying the other. At night, when the noise of investors and critics faded, Howard often found himself staring into the dark, asking the same questions he had asked years earlier in that Brooklyn apartment. Am I building something real, or am I walking toward ruin? Am I honoring my father's memory, or betraying it by building a machine that could swallow people whole? The answers were never clear. The line between purpose and ambition blurred, and sometimes he wondered if he was losing himself in the chase. Yet the small victories kept him moving. The sight of a stranger reading a book in a Starbucks cafe, the laughter of friends around a table with coffee cups in hand, the moment when a barista smiled at a customer who seemed invisible everywhere else. Those fragments of humanity reminded him why he had begun. They reminded him that beneath the corporate structures, the quarterly reports, the endless doubt, there was still a simple truth. Coffee could be a vessel for dignity, for connection, for belonging. But success came at a cost. His family bore the weight of his absences, his relentless focus. His health faltered under the strain. The very dream that had lifted him out of poverty threatened to consume him in other ways. And Howard knew, deep down, that this was the paradox of ambition. It could save you, but it could also break you. Looking back, Howard often returned to the question that haunted him. What if I had given up? What if, when Starbucks rejected his idea, he had accepted it as truth? What if he had listened to the investors, who told him it would never work? What if he had remained the poor kid from Brooklyn, carrying quiet dreams that never saw light? The thought chilled him, because he knew that the line between success and obscurity was terrifyingly thin, and that his own story could have ended as silently as it began. The truth, he realized, was that the first step had always been the hardest. Not the expansions, not the IPO, not the battles with critics, but the first leap of leaving Starbucks to build Il Giornale. The first rejection he refused to accept. The first sleepless night when the weight of possibility threatened to crush him. That was the moment when the rest of the story became possible. And that was the moment most people never reach, because the cost of that first step is too high, too lonely, too uncertain. Howard Schultz's story was never about coffee alone. It was about a boy who grew up invisible and refused to stay that way. It was about carrying the scars of poverty into boardrooms and never letting them fade. It was about the silence of rejection, the fire of defiance, the fragile victories that feel enormous when you come from nothing. Starbucks became a global empire, but beneath the logo and the lattes was a man who never stopped hearing his father's broken voice in the back of his mind. urging him to build a world where dignity was not a luxury. And so, when people asked him what the secret was, Howard did not speak of strategy or market trends. He spoke of pain, of hunger, of the determination born from being underestimated. He spoke of the loneliness of beginnings, the cruelty of rejection, the sweetness of fragile victories. He spoke of the truth he had learned in the dark, that the first step is always taken alone, and that it is always the most dangerous, the most painful, the most transformative. In the end, Howard understood that he had not escaped his past. He had carried it with him, woven it into the very fabric of Starbucks. Every store, every cup, every gathering of strangers was haunted by the boy from Brooklyn who once sat in silence, holding a notebook, unsure if he was building a dream or a ruin. Perhaps the answer was both. Perhaps every dream contains the seeds of ruin, and every ruin the possibility of a dream. What mattered was that he had taken the step, and that step had changed everything.